She inherited nothing but a dry well, then built a home inside that survived the Great Blizzard. Clara stood on the edge of the limestone rim, holding a piece of paper that felt heavier than the dry bucket at her feet. The document was a notice of intent to reclaim, signed by the county clerk but authored by the ink-stained hand of Mr. Miller, the town's primary land speculator. It stated that by November 14, any parcel within the Three Oaks boundary not featuring a habitable structure of permanent manufacture would revert to the public trust for auction. Miller stood 10 yards away, his boots polished to a shine that seemed an insult to the parched, grey earth. He told her that he was being generous by giving her 3 months, considering her husband had been gone since the spring thaw and the property had produced nothing but dust and debt. Clara looked at the well. It was 30 feet deep, narrow, and bone-dry. To the neighbors, it was a scar on a useless plot of land. To Miller, it was a legal loophole. He said, "Mrs. Garrett, a tent is not a house, and a hole in the ground is not a farm. I expect the keys or a deed of sale by the first frost." He didn't wait for an answer, turning his horse back toward the settlement. Clara didn't cry. She calculated. She had no lumber, no money for a mason, and no strength to haul a forest's worth of timber across the flats alone. But she had the well. She had the one thing Miller considered a liability. The contract didn't specify that a home had to be built upward, it only required it to be permanent and habitable. She knelt at the edge and dropped a pebble. She counted the seconds. The impact was a dull thud, not a splash. The earth was packed tight, a mixture of clay and compressed silt that had held its shape for years without a collapse. It was a natural cylinder of insulation. Her father had once told her that the surface of the world was a frantic, changing thing, but 12 feet down, the temperature of the planet never moved. It stayed at 55 degrees, regardless of whether the air above was boiling or frozen. She looked at her calloused hands and the narrow mouth of the shaft. She had 90 days to turn a grave into a sanctuary. The challenge wasn't the heat or the cold, but the displacement of volume. For every cubic foot of living space she wanted, a cubic foot of earth had to come up. She began by searching for the old tripod hoist her husband had abandoned in the shed. Memory was the only tool Clara had that didn't require sharpening. Her father had been a drainage engineer for the railroad, a man who spoke of gradients and hydrostatic pressure the way other men spoke of scripture. He had left her a small leather-bound ledger filled with diagrams of culverts and subterranean footings. As the first week of September burned through the valley, Clara sat by a dim kerosene lamp, tracing the lines of a Roman cistern adaptation. She realized the well wasn't a failure of water, it was a success of stability. The previous owner had lined the first 8 feet with fieldstone to prevent surface erosion, a task that saved her weeks of labor. She knew that to survive a prairie winter, she didn't need a hearth that roared, she needed a space that didn't bleed heat. She spent her second week scavenging. She didn't look for wood, which was expensive and prone to rot. Instead, she looked for the cast-off materials of the mining camps. She found a discarded length of corrugated iron and 2 iron stovepipes that had been crushed at the ends. To anyone passing by, she looked like a scavenger picking through a carcass. Mr. Miller's assistant, a young man named Bennett, rode out on the 10th day to check her progress. He saw her dragging the iron pipes toward the well and laughed. He said, "You planning on breathing through a straw, Mrs. Garrett? There isn't any gold down there, and there sure as hell isn't any water." Clara didn't look up from her knot tying. She said, "The air is free, Mr. Bennett. I suggest you save yours for the ride back." She was busy rigging a double pulley system to the tripod. It was a simple machine, a 3-to-1 mechanical advantage that would allow her to lift 100 pounds of earth while only pulling with 35 pounds of force. She wasn't building a cabin, she was excavating a life. She knew the secret of the dead air space. If she could create a thermal break between the shaft wall and her living quarters, the earth itself would act as a battery. The sun would bake the surface all day, but that heat would take months to migrate downward. By the time the winter arrived, the warmth of the summer would finally reach her walls. It was a delayed reaction engineering feat that the townspeople, with their thin-walled pine shacks, would never understand. They lived in the wind. She intended to live in the history of the soil. She began the descent on the 12th day, armed with a short-handled pick and a sense of desperate geometry. The physical reality of the excavation was a rhythmic, suffocating labor. Clara spent 14 hours a day in the cool dark of the shaft. The process was granular: strike the clay, fill the bucket, climb the ladder, haul the pulley, dump the waste, repeat. By the end of September, she had expanded the bottom of the well from a 4-foot circle into a vaulted chamber 10 feet across. She used the fieldstones she had pried from the surface to create a dry stack retaining wall. There was no mortar, but the physics were elegant and simple. Each stone was tilted slightly outward, using the pressure of the surrounding earth to lock the entire structure into a self-supporting arch. This was the key her father had noted in his ledger: gravity could be an anchor if you gave it the right angle. The skeptics in town began to notice the growing mound of light-colored clay near the wellhead. A local merchant named Mr. Henderson, who ran the dry goods store, stopped his wagon one afternoon to watch her work. He saw the pulley spinning and the dust rising from the hole. He said, "Clara, this is madness. Even if you finish, the first heavy rain will turn that hole into a soup pot. You'll drown in your own cellar." Clara wiped the grit from her eyes and looked at him. She didn't explain the drainage channel she was cutting into the soft shale layer 2 feet below her floor. She didn't tell him about the charcoal-lined sump she had designed to filter any seepage. She simply said, "The rain hasn't come for 3 years, Mr. Henderson. I'll take my chances with the water if it means escaping the wind." He shook his head and drove on, later telling the patrons at the saloon that the widow had finally lost her mind to the heat. But Clara was focused on the measurements. She needed a ceiling height of 7 feet to allow for air stratification. She knew that warm air rose, so she installed a baffler, a simple sheet of iron suspended for inches below the shaft's opening. This created a venturi effect. As the wind blew across the top of the well, it created a low-pressure zone that sucked the stale air out of her chamber, while a secondary pipe she had buried 6 feet deep brought in fresh, tempered air from the surface. It was a passive ventilation system that required no fuel and no fans. It was silent, invisible, and perfectly efficient. By the first week of October, the chamber was carved, the walls were braced, and the internal temperature had leveled out at a constant, cool 55 degrees. She was now living in a space that was 30 degrees cooler than the surface during the day and 20 degrees warmer at night. The strange element that caught the town's attention wasn't the hole itself, but the 2 iron pipes protruding from the ground, angled like the ears of a buried beast. They were positioned 30 feet apart, connected by a subterranean trench Clara had dug by hand and then backfilled. One pipe was the intake, the other the exhaust. To the uninitiated, they looked like scrap metal stuck in the dirt. On the 20th of October, the first frost hit the valley. The temperature on the surface plummeted to 24 degrees. In the town, families huddled around wood stoves, burning through their winter reserves of cordwood at an alarming rate. Clara, however, sat in her chamber 30 feet below the frost line. She had no fire. She had only a single candle and the warmth of her own body. The thermometer she had salvaged from her husband's kit read 54 degrees. The earth was holding its charge. She began the second phase of the build. The ceiling she used a mixture of clay, straw, and a small amount of lime she had traded her wedding ring for to plaster the interior walls. This wasn't for aesthetics, it was for airtight integrity. A drafty underground room would become a damp tomb, but a sealed one would stay dry. She crafted a heavy, insulated hatch for the well opening using 2 layers of salvaged iron with a gap filled with dried prairie grass. The seal was so tight that when she closed it, the outside world vanished. No sound of the howling plains reached her. No dust entered her lungs. Mr. Miller returned on the deadline day, November 14th, accompanied by the county sheriff. He carried a ledger and a look of grim satisfaction. He looked at the barren plot of land, the mound of dirt, and the 2 strange pipes. He didn't see a house. He saw a vacancy. He said, "Time's up, Mrs. Garrett. Where is the habitable structure? All I see is a pile of tailings and some junk." Clara climbed out of the shaft, her clothes stained the color of the deep earth. She didn't argue. She walked to the hatch, unbolted the heavy iron latch, and swung it open. A plume of relatively warm air hit the sheriff's face, smelling of dry earth and lime. She stepped aside and gestured downward. She said, "It is 30 feet deep, braced with stone, sealed with lime, and ventilated by the Bernoulli principle. It is more permanent than any shack in this county, and it is currently 30 degrees warmer than the air you're breathing, Mr. Miller. Would you like to come down and check the square footage?" The sheriff descended first, his hand on his holster, expecting a damp cave. What he found was a geometric marvel. The walls were smooth and whitewashed, the floor was packed and leveled, and the air was remarkably fresh. There was no dampness, no smell of rot. He saw the small desk Clara had fashioned from the crates, her bedroll on a raised platform, and the lantern reflecting off the polished stone walls. He climbed back up, looking at Miller with a mixture of confusion and respect. He said, "It's a house, Miller. It's got a door, it's got air, and it's a hell of a lot sturdier than the hotel in town." The deed stands. Miller was livid. He kicked at one of the intake pipes. He said, "This is a trick. This is a cellar, not a residence. You can't live like a badger and call it a home." Clara didn't blink. She said, "The law says habitable structure, it doesn't say which direction it has to face. This home won't burn in a fire, won't blow away in a cyclone, and won't freeze in a blizzard. Can you say the same for your office?" Miller left, but the social pressure didn't stop. The town began to call her the Badger Widow. They made jokes about her burying herself alive. But the weather was shifting. The old-timers noted the way the cattle were huddling and the way the birds had vanished overnight. By the first week of December, the sky turned a bruised, heavy purple. A pressure drop so sharp it made people's ears pop rolled across the plains. This wasn't a standard winter storm, it was the beginning of what would later be known as the Great Blizzard of 1886. The temperature on the surface dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. The wind picked up to 60 miles per hour, carrying a fine, crystalline snow that blinded anything in its path. In town, the pine shacks began to groan. The heat from the wood stoves was being sucked out through the gaps in the floorboards as fast as the wood could burn. People started to realize that the common sense of building upward was a liability in a land that wanted to flatline everything. Clara retreated to her well. She pulled the hatch shut and dropped the iron bolt. She didn't need to check the sky anymore. She knew the physics would hold. She had 6 months of dried food and a ventilation system that the snow couldn't block because of the high-velocity exhaust angle. As the world above turned into a white, screaming void, Clara sat in the silence of 54 degrees, reading her father's ledger by the light of a single, steady flame. She was the only person in the county who wasn't fighting the storm. She was simply letting it pass over her. The storm reached its crescendo on the third night, a sustained roar that sounded less like wind and more like the grinding of tectonic plates. Above ground, the world had ceased to exist in 3 dimensions. The visibility was zero, a white wall of frozen needles moving at 65 miles per hour, stripping the paint from the few standing buildings in town and driving through the smallest cracks in window frames. In the settlement, the situation was becoming a catastrophe of thermodynamics. The settlers had built their homes based on the architecture of the East, using thin pine boards and balloon frame construction that relied entirely on the constant combustion of fuel to maintain an equilibrium against the exterior cold. But the wood was wet, the chimneys were choking on downdrafts, and the sheer velocity of the wind was pulling heat out of the buildings through a process of forced convection faster than any hearth could replace it. Mr. Henderson's general store, which served as a makeshift shelter for 3 families whose roofs had already collapsed under the weight of 4-foot snowdrifts, was failing. The temperature inside the store had dropped to 15 degrees, and the breath of the huddled children hung in the air like ghost fog. Henderson looked at the frost creeping across the floorboards and realized that within 6 hours, they would begin to lose the youngest among them to hypothermia. He remembered the 2 iron pipes sticking out of the ground on the Garrett plot, 2 miles up the ridge. He remembered the Badger Widow and her ridiculous hole in the ground. In a moment of clarity born of desperation, he realized that if Clara was still alive, it wasn't because of luck, it was because she had moved herself outside the path of the wind's kinetic energy. He gathered the men, wrapped them in every blanket they possessed, and began the brutal, blind crawl toward the ridge. They didn't use horses, the animals would have frozen mid-stride. They used a guide rope and a compass, moving through a landscape that had been rewritten by the drifts, searching for a grave that might actually be a lifeboat. The physics of the surface were chaotic and deadly, but Clara, 30 feet below, was experiencing a different reality altogether. Her candle didn't even flicker. The heavy earth above her acted as a low-pass filter, absorbing the violence of the storm and translating it into a faint, rhythmic thrumming that was almost melodic. The hatch didn't just open, it was hammered upon from above, a frantic, muffled drumming that Clara recognized as the sound of human knuckles hitting frozen iron. She stood up, her muscles stiff but her core temperature a steady, comfortable 98 degrees, and began the ascent. It took her 10 minutes to clear the ice that had accumulated around the rim of the hatch, a build-up caused by the moisture in her own breath meeting the sub-zero air at the exhaust vent. When she finally threw the bolt and heaved the iron lid upward, she was met with a wall of white and the near-frozen face of Mr. Henderson. He was unrecognizable, his beard a solid mask of ice, his eyes narrowed to slits. Beside him, 2 other men were slumped in the snow, their movements lethargic and uncoordinated, the final stage before the body gives up the fight. Clara didn't ask questions. She grabbed Henderson by the collar of his heavy wool coat and hauled him toward the opening. She said, "Get them down the ladder. One at a time. Do not stop to pray and do not stop to talk." The transition was a physical shock to the men. They tumbled from a world of negative 40 degrees into the heavy, silent warmth of the well chamber. As they hit the floor of the vault, the sudden increase in temperature felt like a physical weight. Their frozen clothes began to steam, filling the small space with the scent of wet wool and wood smoke. Henderson lay on the packed clay floor, gasping as the blood began to flow back into his extremities with a localized, stinging heat. He looked around the room, seeing the whitewashed stone, the dry bedroll, and the single candle that stood as a testament to the absolute stillness of the air. He saw no fire, yet he felt no chill. It was a sensory contradiction that his mind couldn't immediately process. He looked at Clara, who was calmly rebolting the hatch, and he saw the lack of desperation in her eyes. She wasn't a survivor of the storm, she was a resident of the earth. He whispered, his voice cracking from the ice in his lungs, "How is it hot in here? You don't have a stove. You don't have a hearth. The world is ending up there, and you're sitting in a summer afternoon." Clara sat on her crates and poured a cup of water from a pitcher that wasn't even skimmed with ice. She looked at Henderson and the others, their bodies slowly thawing in the 54-degree sanctuary. She said, "It isn't hot, Mr. Henderson. It is merely the Earth's memory of September. You spent your life building boxes to catch the wind, and then you act surprised when the wind takes what you give it. I didn't build a house, I reclaimed a constant." The skeptic in Henderson, even in his weakened state, demanded a reason he could grasp. He looked at the walls and said, "There has to be a trick. The ground is frozen solid for 5 feet. We had to pick through ice just to find your hatch." Clara leaned forward, her voice matter-of-fact and devoid of the madness the town had attributed to her. She said, "The physics are elegant and simple, though I suppose they are invisible to men who only look at the horizon. The frost line only goes so deep. Below that, the Earth maintains the average annual temperature of the region. It is a thermal mass of nearly infinite capacity. It takes months for the heat of the sun to soak into these depths, and months for it to radiate back out. While you were shivering in your pine boards, I was wrapped in 3 million tons of insulation. The pipes you laughed at aren't just for breathing. They are a heat exchanger. The air coming in passes through 30 feet of buried conduit, warming up to the ground's temperature before it ever hits my face. No fan, no pump, no mechanical anything. Just the pressure of the atmosphere and the stability of the soil." She showed them the ledger, the diagrams of the venturi vents and the drainage sumps. She explained that the dryness they felt was due to the charcoal layers she had packed behind the stone, which absorbed the humidity and prevented the cave damps they all feared. She wasn't a mystic and she wasn't lucky, she was an engineer who had treated her survival as a series of calculated decisions rather than a gamble against the weather. The men listened in a silence that was deeper than the storm. They realized that the Badger widow had been the only person in the valley who had actually understood the land they were trying to tame. They were invaders fighting the surface, she was a tenant who had moved into the foundation. The Great Blizzard lasted for 6 days, but for those inside the garret well, it was merely a period of quiet observation. When the winds finally died and the sun broke through a sky of crystalline blue, the world they emerged into was unrecognizable. The town of Three Oaks had been decimated. 24 structures had collapsed, and several families had been found frozen in their beds, their fires having gone out in the middle of the night. Mr. Miller's grand office, with its imported glass and oak siding, was a pile of splintered timber, its foundation cracked by the heaving of the frozen ground. The social reversal was immediate and total. There was no more talk of habitable structures or legal loopholes. The county sheriff, who had survived only because he had been in the jail's stone cellar, officially recorded Clara Garrett's subterranean vault as the gold standard for frontier homesteading. Mr. Miller, facing the ruin of his investments and the cold reality of his own poor planning, approached Clara 2 weeks after the thaw. He didn't come with a notice of reclamation, he came with a proposal. He said, "Mrs. Garrett, the people are afraid to rebuild. They see the wood as a trap now. I want to hire you to oversee the construction of a new district, what the papers are already calling the Garrett Vaults. We have the labor and the stone, but we don't have the math. Name your price." Clara didn't take his money to become a builder, she took it to establish a school of practical frontier engineering. She didn't want to be a landlord, she wanted to ensure that the next generation didn't have to rely on the mercy of the wind. Within 5 years, the ridge was dotted with the Vierslav intake pipes, and the population of the valley moved half underground. The town didn't look like a town anymore, it looked like a series of gentle mounds and iron hatches, a silent, resilient civilization that had learned to trade the vanity of the skyline for the security of the strata. The legacy of the Garrett well survived long after the frontier had been settled and the era of the wild plains had passed into history. By the 1930s, when the Dust Bowl began to scour the Midwest, the Garrett-style homes were the only ones that remained habitable, their inhabitants protected from the suffocating silt and the searing heat by the same 55-degree constant that Clara had first harnessed. Archaeologists in the 21st century would eventually uncover the site of the original well, finding the stonework as tight and plumb as the day it was stacked. They found the remains of the iron hatch and the lead-line drainage sumps, noting that the design was centuries ahead of its time in terms of passive geothermal efficiency. The historical record doesn't remember Clara as a widow or a victim of an unfair ultimatum. Instead, the bronze plaque at the site of the Three Oaks Museum identifies her as the pioneer of subterranean architecture. The narrative of the American West is often told through the lens of those who built tall and loud, but the Garrett story remains a quietly elegant correction to that myth. It serves as a documented account of how human grit, when paired with the overlooked laws of physics, can turn a dry hole in the dirt into an unbreakable sanctuary. The legacy is one of economic pragmatism and sensory realism. It is the story of a woman who didn't fight the earth, but rather, invited it to protect her. In the end, the most permanent thing she left behind wasn't the house itself, but the proof that survival is not a matter of luck, but a matter of measurement. The Badger widow had proven that while the wind may own the sky, the wise own the ground beneath it. The Garrett well stands today not as a ruin, but as a monument to the quiet triumph of competence over tradition, a stone-lined testament to the day the frontier stopped fighting the cold and finally went home to the earth.